folks, we seem to be having some technical difficulties, and instead of wasting 15 minutes of your time trying to figure it out, I'll figure it out later. This video talks about the reason why people fall away from church is because of sin. It seems like a given that would be the case, that the reason why people would cease to be in church is because they have sin in their life. When we talk about welcome home, sometimes it doesn't really matter how welcoming home can be, because the people that are there know us extremely well. You know, the one good thing about St. John's is that it's such a small, tight-knit community. You know the one bad thing about St. John's? Is it's such a small and tight-knit community. That if you do one thing that's wrong, that if you sin in any which kind of way, chances are at least half to the majority of people within the congregation will know about it. And not because people are going around saying, oh, can you believe so-and-so said this, or so-and-so did that? But because the truth is that most of you are related to one another. And like a family does, they often talk about the poor choices that were made and how truly awful that is. There was a young man who had everything going for him. He had a stellar career ahead of him. He was going to law school. He was ahead of everyone in his class. He was diligent to his work. But then something happened. He wanted to drop out of law school. He didn't want to do that anymore. And he told that to his father, and his father, to say that he was frustrated would be an understatement. You see, his father had such high hopes and expectations for him. His father had such a humble upbringing. He was a poor peasant at one point and has since elevated himself to be a businessman, an entrepreneur when it came to mining. But Martin Luther didn't want to be what his father wanted him to be. He was going to be something different. And on his way to go figure out what possibly he could do with his life, a massive storm came up, and lightning struck around him, and he was so terrified that at one moment he would be walking, and the next he would be standing before the Lord, answering for his very life, that he made God a deal. Spare my life, and I'll go into the monastery and serve you. And I'd like to say that his return home and his relationship with his Father in heaven was perfect and stellar right away, but it wasn't. He struggled a lot under the pressure of meeting somebody else's expectations for himself. To the point, like we said earlier, he hated God for that. And then he came across that portion that he read in Romans, and it opened his eyes to see the wonder of God's love and his devotion and his faithfulness. Martin Luther and that young man in the parable of the prodigal son have something in common. They have a father whose expectations were not met. I think all of us know what it's like to deal with people that are angry. They get ticked off, that fly off the hinges, that say all kinds of mean things, look at us in all kinds of harsh tones, and lash out. And we're comfortable with anger because we know what it's going to look like and how it's going to feel. And those people might be upset for a little while, but in the long run, that anger doesn't affect us for our entire lives. But you know what does affect us? Is when that one person that we love, that we respect, that we cherish above all else, looks at you and me when we have done something or said something or thought something and says, I am so disappointed. Or to personalize it a little bit more, when they look at you and they say, I am so disappointed in you. The reason why that hurts so much is because anger is an emotional response. We get it. We're doing something that you don't like, you feel jilted in some way, so you're going to lash out and be angry and be stubborn and pig-headed and be upset and bitter about it for a while, but then eventually it'll be done. Well, like a duck, we'll let that water roll off of our backs and you'll let it roll off of yours, and eventually we'll get it worked out and it'll be fine. But that's it. The anger is about what was said or what was done. It was about a situation. But disappointment's a whole other beast altogether, isn't it? Because disappointment isn't necessarily just about a situation, it's about the person. Whether it was a grandmother, a sister, a mother, an aunt, an uncle, a father, a grandparent, whatever it was, when that person looks at you over something that you said or you did that was wrong and says, I am so disappointed in you, Justin, Stacy, fill in the blank. You lost something. They no longer look at you the same way anymore. They no longer think of you the same way anymore. And they may do their best to treat you the same, but you and I know it's not the same. That we've lost their trust. We've lost their favor, their appreciation of this relationship that we've had with them. And so we often do the thing that any hurt person does whenever they hear those words. We often harden our hearts and we walk away. And we try and fix that in ourselves, but we can't. Martin Luther and this young man in the parable got to a place where they hit rock bottom. For Luther, it was in a field with lightning striking around him and the possibility of standing before God, answering for every thought, word, and action he ever thought, felt, or experienced. But for that rich man, or for that young man, his wealth was gone, his family, he thought, hated him. He was in a distant country, far from those that he loved, far from those that he knew. And he was working in a field for somebody that could care less about him and what he liked and how he felt. That life was so bad for him that he was working amongst the pigs. And for those of you who aren't Jewish, which is about 99% of you, that wasn't okay. Because a pig was the most unclean animal that there could possibly be. It didn't just eat slop, but crapped and rolled around in it. And God said, don't associate with these animals, because as soon as you do, you are unclean. That son made one bad choice. Dad, I want you dead, but I can't get you dead now, so give me my stuff. And then he left. And then he squandered it all with drugs, alcohol, women, whatever it would have been. And then when all of his stuff was gone, and all of his supposed friends that he may have gathered with the money he was forking out left him, all that was left was a pen of poop and pigs. And poverty, where all he wanted was the pods that the pigs were eating. And like what everyone always does is they know that I can go back home. It's going to take a lot for me to get back there. I'm going to have to overcome some pride. Even though I know I've done wrong, I'm going to have to choke that down and acknowledge it some way. Because the fact is that the pride is going to prevent me from wanting to hear anything that may come out of my Father's mouth. And I know what my Father's going to say, so instead I'm going to cut him off. I'm going to know what he's going to say, so I'm going to acknowledge it first, ahead of time. And just maybe if I acknowledge what I've done and I throw myself down, that maybe those harsh glares, those difficult words, those sins that everyone knows about me won't come out because they'll have been dealt with. And so he goes home and he sees his father. And don't you love how this story goes? He sees his father. His father runs out to him after he's been filled with compassion. And he stops his father dead in his tracks and he says, "Dad, I've sinned against heaven and against you. And I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." And then right before he's about to get into what he could do to maybe have a better standing in his father's eyes, his dad stops him. He stops him dead in his tracks. He won't let him utter the words of what he thinks he should be doing, or what he could possibly do to fix the situation. He stops him dead in his tracks and he tells him that he loves him by taking a robe, the finest of robes, and clothing him in it. By taking a ring and putting it on his finger. By taking a sandal and placing it on his feet. All of us have expectations for ourselves and for others. But none of them match up to God's expectation for us. And we know of God's expectations for us and for everyone else. And it's so easy when we see those who have wandered away to point out how easy it was for them to fail in that expectation. And that disappointment that they felt in themselves comes flooding right back. What's beautiful about this is that the father doesn't ignore the pain that his son caused him. He doesn't ignore the complete and utter appearance of a son who's literally caked in mud and crap from head to toe. He doesn't ignore anything that his son has done, but what he does do is he does suffer the humiliation. He does embrace the pain of his son's guilt and shame. He does make a point not to bring it up. Instead, what he makes a point to do is to tell him, this is not who you are. Whatever it was that drove you away, that's not who I see before me now. I see my son. I see my daughter. I don't see a poor person in the most vile, uncleanliest state a person can be in. I see somebody who is royalty. I see a beloved child who's not a servant but a prince, who's not left with nothing but has been restored to everything. Friends, do you know why sin is so bad? It's not because God says don't do something and we do it, or do something and we don't do it. It's not just about the fact that God wrote some laws on some tablets 2,000 years ago, or because he wrote that law into our hearts. That's not what's really so bad about sin. What's really so bad about sin is that God is so good. What's really so wicked about sin is that God is so just. What's really so awful about sin is that we would rather love ourselves instead of being loved unconditionally by our Father. That we would rather stand on our own 2 feet on sinking sand than rest securely on a solid foundation of love and favor and devotion to a God who does everything for us, who protects us in our comings and goings, who gives us our food in the proper time, who clothes us, who does more than just blow on our knees when we scrape them on the ground, but who mends and restores and heals. And when that disappointment that we feel in ourselves because we could see the hurt on our Father's face is there, He's there to scoop us up and comfort us. To celebrate with us because we're no longer lost and we're no longer strangers, but we're found and we're children and we're His. Martin Luther and this young son had two great inheritances that were given. The son was restored with a ring and a robe and a sandal and a feast. He was no longer outcast, but he was welcomed home as if he never left. And Martin Luther, well, the disappointment that his father felt toward him, and the disappointment that he felt in himself was replaced by absolute joy by a God who gave him the task and the inheritance of taking something that was lost and restoring it to the people so that once again all people who trust in the Lord are welcome into His house and His family. The easiest thing to do is to look at the shortcomings of others or the shortcomings of ourselves and think, because of these, I have no place here. Because of what I've done or what I've said, I'm not welcome. And it's because you have those things that you are. It's because you've done those things that Jesus wants you here. It's because that you and I were lost that He says, welcome home. That He takes the uncleanliness of our actions off of us and replaces us with something beautiful. And so with that, welcome home. Amen.